Hey everybody, John Greenwood here. I am revisiting my old Star Trek kriegsspiel system and explaining what worked, what didn't, and what I'd change. For this video, I'm going to be using Adobe Illustrator, PowerPoint, and my system design documents. So the core of this system was submarines in space, and I gave this explanation up front to the players so that they have a little bit of bearing on what they should be doing. The idea is that the players have a very narrow view of the world around them, and for the most part, they're essentially guessing where the enemy is. So if I were to pull up an older screenshot of one of the play tests, you can see that compared to the actual view of the map, the player is all the way down here, and this is their view, and the planet looks huge compared to the actual size of the map. The way I was able to do this is that the map is run on an SVG file, so I can actually zoom all the way in or out as needed and have things be huge or small, because an SVG is infinitely scalable. It's just based on math rather than pixels. This creates sort of interesting moments and a lot of tension in the game. It almost feels like a horror game sometimes, which is really interesting for kriegsspiel. Definitely a strong showcase of the whole fog of war thing. In terms of mission structures, you want your objectives to not be just destroy the other ship. You typically want to create scenarios where, you know, destruction becomes necessary to accomplish the objective, but it's just sort of a means to an end. So, you know, both teams are fighting over this planet maybe, and they're coming from opposite sides. And then, you know, as they get closer and they pursue the objectives, and they both realize that they're in orbit around the same planet and they're fighting over the same objective, well, now they got to fight, right? So you can create conflict without outright going from the beginning and saying the objective is just to destroy the other ship. You typically want to make it a little more interesting than that. Having it be something else is just a little bit more interesting and creates more creativity from the players, because they're not thinking of it like a board game. They're thinking of it like, you know, if the Federation's objective is to rescue the colonists on Kappa Sigma 2, and the Klingon objective is to abduct those sane colonists, then all of a sudden the situation becomes a lot more interesting. Like, the Klingons could kidnap the people, put them on the ship, and then like have them as, you know, human shield hostages against the Federation, create all kinds of intriguing scenarios. Maybe that objective isn't specifically the best, but hopefully you get sort of the gist of what I'm saying. There's a couple of key faction differences. So all of the Federation ships, according to the lore, have no cloaking devices, which means that they're going to be visible most of the time unless a planet or something blocks them. So like if the Federation's on this side of the planet and the Klingons are on this side of the planet, like, their scanners just wouldn't sense the Federation ship because they're literally on the other side of the planet. They have no line of sight on them, right? Meanwhile, the Romulan and Klingon ships, and in fact most ships in Star Trek lore, it seems like, do have cloaking devices. And a useful analogy here is submarines going for a deep dive, right? Which is why I sort of gave the players this idea of like your submarines in space, because that's sort of how the writers of the original series actually wrote the episodes. Like, they would take you know, old submarine warfare stuff from World War II and write about that. Like, Gene Roddenberry actually served in the Navy, and so, you know, he kind of had a sense of what he was talking about and used the Navy as a very strong analogy for Star Trek. So when you use the Navy as an analogy for Star Trek, it actually ends up feeling very authentic to the lore, even though you might have a few differences. But yeah, so anyways, moving on to sort of the map. One of the first obstacles that you're going to encounter when you're creating a space combat system is the scale issue. There's just no way to depict things accurately to scale because space is just so absurdly large, right? And a human or even a human ship is atomic in scale compared to celestial bodies and the relative distances between them. So what I did is I hand waved all that by saying, well, look, basically, if a human is flying this ship, do you really think we're not smart enough to create an interface that sort of interprets the data in a way that's going to be legible to a human, right? That's probably one of the first things that we would do, is create tools for us to be able to more easily understand things, right? So that's one of the first problems that's solved by the system. Just kind of hand waving and saying, well, look, this isn't actually one-to-one depiction of what's happening on the scale. There is a one-to-one something happening over here, but we're depicting it as you would see it on your monitor. And your monitor is depicting things in a different way so that you can actually see things, as a normal human and understand them. Ships are extremely small on this. This is actually too big. It should be something like this. And good luck showing that on a after action report, right? And then the other problem was that there was no grid squares here, right? You just have no idea sort of where you are unless you're right next to a planet. And it can be very disorienting. So I think in the future I would have a grid system, just label all the grids. They don't have to be really tiny grids. They could be really big grids, I think. This is probably big enough. In most places, most of the time, you're going to be able to see at least an edge of the grid and sort of get a sense of where you are. And then that sort of helps in terms of, navigating the system, telling the umpire where you want to go, right? So I'm going to come in on E3. I'm going to scoop around to the east towards E4, and then I'm going to go in a beeline towards grid B4 towards this planet here, and that's going to be my turn or whatever, right? And now that's just a lot more easy to accomplish now that there's grid squares. It's also easier for me, the umpire, to sort of tell players, oh, you picked up some kind of explosion from grid D1. Maybe we should go check that out. Something like that, right? It just makes things a lot more easy when you have a grid like this. And realistically, wouldn't they have some sort of equivalent when they're navigating a star system in the future, right? Even the featureless expanse of the ocean nowadays, there's grids for the ocean specifically for this purpose. So again, using the Navy as an analogy, yeah, you would probably do something like this. Would you make them squares instead of rectangles? That I don't know, but yeah, you would do something sort of like this to make the map readable for a person. There were other components of the maps. There were radar bands attached to the ships. I'm going to try to find an image of these. Icon was with one item, and then these bands were another group, and then the baffles were another group, and then the protractor on top of it was another group. The protractor was hidden from the players. It was just more for my reference, so that I could tell the players. We've got an enemy signature on long range scanners about 40 degrees or something, bearing 040 approximately. I didn't really do the 041 or whatever, except unless it was really, really far away. In this case, I would just say approximately 040 sort of thing, to let the players know vaguely where the enemy is. And then I would sort of screenshot things like this around this square so that it could be the same size. And then I had a Photoshop file here's the raw screenshot, and it gets cropped by the mask layer. And then you apply the radar template on top of it so that only the rings glow. And then you apply the color filter on top of it, so all the gray bits become the color, and then all the white bits become sort of glowy, right? You have green, red, but all of this created a lot of work for turn updates. So even though players were very impressed and it was very pretty, I don't think it's really worth it. Personally, there were radar bands like these. There was the baffles cone, and then there was sort of a long-range scanner cone that was the opposite of this on the front. And if you were in the long-range scanner cone, there was a chance that you could be detected at long range. Again, you have sort of a baffles situation, analogous to submarines again, because, you know, the waste coming out of the engines, the propulsion device, would sort of mess with your sensors, which creates tactical opportunities hiding in the baffles. Players quickly figured that out, which forces interesting counter strategies like a Crazy Ivan or something. I used compasses and protractors for angle calculations, and I had a weird exponential ruler for warp jumping, basically. I'm not sure I would use that in the future. Players didn't really notice that they were moving at an exponential rate, even though they were, so it was a lot of extra work for basically no value, in terms of like, did the player actually notice that I moved them accurately, right? That it was an actual like exponentially faster movement than normal? No. Yeah, so like the main problem with the original system is it's extremely tedious. Every turn update requires multiple steps. You know, you gotta do the base screenshot, you gotta apply the mask, you gotta do the glow effects, you gotta do the color code for the faction, you gotta export it and then post it to Discord, and do that at least twice, sometimes 3 times per turn, and the end result looks great, but it's just unsustainable. You get burned out really fast. So yeah, in terms of improvements for if I were to do this again, labeled grid coordinates, right? Letting players give clearer orders in like the maneuver phase, I guess you would call it, the equivalent of for ship combat. Then there's no more need for vague descriptions, and it makes navigation and planning more efficient, and it lets me as the umpire do things. In terms of orientation, I just called this north to south. Like, I just made some bullshit explanation about how this is the galactic north and this is the galactic south, which gives a logical explanation for consistent descriptions, right? The idea is that they're using Earth-like analogies because it's supposed to be understandable to humans. In terms of resolution and like using an SVG, I don't think it's actually necessary to run the game in an SVG, and it's actually probably a bad idea to run it as an SVG. Using the labeled grid system kind of helps with that issue, because most engagements aren't going to exceed a single grid square. Definitely not 2 grid squares, because your weapons wouldn't reach that far, right? And so what you can do is you can create like a little square that's like 2 grid squares big, and then you can just put it over the players and render that to do the engagement, and then, you know, work off of that map instead of working off of this massive SVG. I don't know. Maybe there's more efficient ways to do this, but this seems like a pretty elegant solution. You could generate the squares ahead of time, like so, in an array, and use those, or you could, you know, generate it on the fly as needed, depending on the center of the engagement, and this would avoid all the stability and control issues that occur with Adobe Illustrator, in terms of like running the actual game. In terms of making the map ahead of time, I think Adobe Illustrator is probably the way to go. I don't really see a better way to make this sort of map except for an SVG. The other thing is, with this sort of map, now that you're like rendering things on the fly and there's like a couple different levels of resolution, you know, you can have like bigger pieces and have them be more easily controlled by the umpire during the maneuver stage of things. And then things are more visible in the after action report. And then once they get closer, like this, and they're within this square that we talked about, now we can render out the map and have, you know, the map look like this and scale these pieces down. Or, well, not scale them down, but like this map would be larger. And so now these pieces are like this size on the map or something like that. And then for the planets specifically, one of the main reasons I wanted an SVG is to be able to zoom in to the planet level and then easily zoom out. But that can actually be accomplished just by having like a cutout view of the planet, and then you don't have to worry about it. And if it's a different planet, you just change the number on here and like delete this moon over here, and like you could do this in a PowerPoint slide, right? And this doesn't even need to be in Adobe Illustrator. And since most engagements in my experience, like if we look at some of these screenshots, like majority of the engagements are going to take place within the immediate vicinity of a planet, since all the objectives are going to be in the immediate vicinity of a planet. Like as long as you make this cutout big enough, maybe it needs a bit more space or something, as long as this is big enough, like you're going to have enough space to run the whole engagement, and there's just no actual need for this massive SVG. This could be more easily run on something like PowerPoint or Photoshop or just Paint, anything else. This is much less work than managing the planet views on the full map. In terms of rendering attacks and so on, here's an image with an attack occurring. So what this was is I just manually drew lines on the image towards the ship where it's being fired. And then explosion effects, I would add those manually. Like these are just manual additions, and you just leave them there. You leave them in place on the map, which creates persistent remnants of the battle, which is pretty dynamic and cool. Right, it's space, so this isn't really going to meaningfully move within the parameters of the scenario. Other players might stumble upon, you know, destroyed moons or wreckage, you know, a destroyed ship of another player, which creates really cool moments of discovery, right? Finding evidence of these unseen battles, and then you just follow this debris trail to where the other players are. So yeah, the gist of improving this would be using a grid system to standardize the view of engagements, and then these pre-made planet templates for the most common scenarios to reduce workload. So what I did was, out of combat we use variable time, and then in combat we use more standard time, and you would change to regular intervals. So in combat you use 10 seconds per turn, so there's 5 seconds for the action to resolve and then 5 seconds to give the next set of orders. This is limited to 12 spoken words, which would be a physical time constraint of speaking, which was a unique asset of the system, and players actually responded really well to this. The characteristics of combat under the system is that it's extremely fast. Most engagements lasted under 60 seconds, 60 seconds or less under, you know, in-game time we're talking about. So that's 6 turns of combat at most. The longest one, I think, was 2 minutes. And this is because combat is extremely lethal, and players quickly realize just how dangerous the system is. And, you know, there's a very serious possibility that they're going to die, which results in, you know, tactics of hit and run attacks. So you get as many hits as you can in, and then you get out with as few as possible, you know, warp in and out. Hit and run tactics versus a prolonged battle, which sort of coincides with the lore and sort of what goes on in an actual Star Trek episode. In terms of the warp system, what I had was multiple warp settings, right? You have like warp 1 through warp 9 technically in lore. In game, I only did up to warp 8, but players can't really mentally juggle more than 2 to 3 speeds anyways, and most differences between the levels sort of felt meaningless. And then it was also like really dumb to do warp 1, because when you're outside of combat, there was no real need to go into warp 1. You would just go into impulse mode and then like sail very casually over to your destination, because you know that I'm going to fast forward the time up until the point where it's relevant to make decisions. And then like beyond warp 3 or something, like, there really wasn't like a meaningful difference in terms of player experience for how fast they were moving, even though I was using an exponential ruler, right? Each rung of the ruler was exponentially larger than the last. Like, players couldn't actually feel it. So I think limiting the warp speeds from 9 to like 2 or 3, right? Because basically the only meaningful difference in terms of players, right? Like when you're in a star system, right? Like most warp is just going to jump you out of the system straight away. If we're talking about like warp 7 is just going to like yeet you out of the system immediately. And so you're off the map now, and there's no point of even depicting it, and then you have like no sort of sense of like where you are relative to things and like how fast you're actually moving compared to other warp speeds. Like the big difference that players actually felt was between warp 6 and warp 7, because warp 7 causes hull integrity damage over time, and that was the only thing that players could actually feel, and there was a clear risk reward factor for going faster than warp 6. At warp 7, the hull gradually takes damage and it can't be repaired while at warp, and I applied damage. It was just a flat damage number, but it would be according to a die roll at sort of regular intervals. So every tick I would roll the die and see if you get damaged. Inevitably, averaged out over time, you would suffer a lot of damage if you maintained warp 7. It was risky, but it was effective for escape or pursuing other players, and players found this mechanic really fun. Nobody thought it was unfair. It was forecasted well ahead of time. What I would do for the first tick is to give them a description of like their ship is like groaning and straining under the pressure of the strain of what they're doing to it with warp 7, to give them a sense of like, okay, my ship like actually is getting damaged. And then past, I think tick number 2, I always applied damage, so that if they come out of warp after tick number 1, they see that their ship was damaged. And then starting on tick 3 onward, I just started rolling, which was pretty effective. And players found this mechanic really fun and had good things to say about warp 6 versus warp 7. I don't think anybody really understood or felt the difference between warp 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I like put a lot of work into like making them. And yeah, like I mean, just focus on the user experience, right? Like just do like generic low warp versus maybe high warp. Low warp is like, the warp that you use within a system, and high warp is the warp that you use outside of a system or to escape from a system, and high warp is the one that really damages you big time. I think that's probably the relevant thing for this system. I also had this really weird, complex acceleration turn radius thing. Hold on, let me show you. Yeah, this whole business, yeah, don't do this. Players don't understand or care, and so I was doing a lot of work that like nobody even understood and nobody really felt or like cared about. Honestly, impulse as a whole is just kind of a non-starter at this scale. I think like the whole point of Impulse is to sort of act as an analogy for like, okay, we're going to do a, you know, 1/4 fast, you know, half fast, full speed ahead sort of thing, you know, speeds from the Navy, right? That's what it's trying to replicate. And so you can already replicate that with just like warp speed or something. I don't know. Definitely you want like full stop, right? You can do a stop, but all this quarter impulse, blah, 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 blah. No, like nobody cares. Full stop, impulse, and then like warp, low warp, high warp, I think is plenty. Might even be too much. Yeah, just do that. Don't do this whole complicated turn stuff. Like players just aren't gonna feel it. They aren't gonna feel that you're doing all the math correctly and like the degrees are correct and all that, like the turn radius is right. They just don't care, and they're not going to experience it in these little screenshot snippets that you send them. So just save yourself the bother and don't do it. The next big thing was status reports. This is the big success story of the system. Players absolutely loved this, and it provided a functional purpose and a handy, beautiful little presentation. So you kill two birds with one stone with these status reports. How it's built is there's a template PowerPoint slide showing starship capabilities, and you can just kind of delete stuff on here. It's just kind of a blank template like this. But anyways, you fill in details as the game progresses. So maybe they've been running through ammo for some time. Maybe their power is low, their shields are low, right? And yeah, so you can edit this for your record as an umpire. You don't give this to the player every single turn. You sort of give relevant changes, right? So if their power is dangerously low at like 30%, maybe their navigator says, you know, Captain, the power's at 30% or something, or like shields at 50% or whatever, right? Relevant things that come up in the heat of the moment, and then, you know, a detailed description of like how many torpedoes they have and all this stuff over here. Like that's not going to be something that somebody shouts out on the bridge deck. There's also an alert level indicator, so you can just quickly change the color. Now it's yellow alert. There's also a crew counter with the souls, so you decrease this to indicate that they've taken casualties. In terms of power, it's pretty simple. Yellow means there's power, and black means you spent that, and then red would mean like this is permanently damaged and you need to sort of do repairs, and it's only ever going to fill up to this much. So now you only have like half what you did normally. Same sort of thing with the hull integrity. So it would go down if you took damage, and then this would be like damage to the system itself that needs to, like, you need to go to dry dock basically or something to fix this. And it would be the same thing with hull integrity. Is like, all right, we need to go back to Starbase to fix this. You know, it lets players understand at a glance like why they should retreat in this scenario, or like what's wrong with their ship. It lets them know the status of their shields and their hull without you having to type it out every time, and you can just give them a screenshot and they understand it immediately instead of like getting lost in a bunch of paragraphs. It's just a simple image. Done. Yeah, and then there's also like this kind of badge of honor system, right? So I would have these indicate where you got hit, and they would be red when you haven't repaired them, and then I would just turn them gray when you do repair them, and these would be like ongoing fires to tell you where there's a fire on the ship. And then on the systems end thing, I just put a red line through the system that's offline, and you can see a hierarchy here. So if I wanted to repair my 4 torpedo tube, I first have to repair weapons bay, because weapons bay, there's a problem with it. Maybe there's a hull integrity issue, and it's not safe to repair the forward torpedo tube. The change that I would have with this is I didn't have an indication of like what the priority is for the repair. So the engineers would repair things sort of on their own unless the players told them the priorities. And I would make a judgment of like, okay, the engineers are going to repair engineering first. A simple little star is probably enough to let the player know that okay, the engineers have been told to prioritize weapons bay or something. You could create another indicator like an arrow or something to show that this is what they're repairing. That could be a thing. So now the player knows that they're repairing this and you've told them to prioritize this, or you've told them to prioritize the forward torpedo tube, so they have to repair weapons bay first. But yeah, this systems list was a really elegant solution, and it creates a lot of interesting moments. If the transporter is taken down, then you get all these stranded crew drama moments, like first officer is stranded on the planet, or like they have to, teleport out the VIP to rescue them, and they can't because the transporter's broken. Stuff like that. What I would not include in the future is this acceleration and radius stuff. Again, like people just do not understand that. Warp is probably okay to use, but like, yeah, this stuff, like people just do not care about that stuff. It's overly complex. The time estimates for the repairs, generally I design them to be way too long to matter in combat, right? Combat is 10 seconds. You're not repairing anything in 10 seconds. In combat, I would use die rolls to determine if the repairs are successful that tick. Out of combat, i.e. you've turned off power and you're hiding behind a moon and you like ran away, I would average out the rolls. So a D20 roll with X% success would have an average repair time of like, say, 10 minutes. So I don't roll any die outside of combat. I just apply the average time, and then because it's a variable time system, usually it would turn out to like, okay, you ran away and you hid for 10 minutes behind the moon and the enemy couldn't find you, so now it's been 10 minutes and you've just received the report that your systems are repaired, and now we could get back to it. In terms of damage resolution, there were two types of damages, right? There was phaser fire and torpedo fire. For phaser fire, I didn't roll to hit because in Star Trek, phasers are computer guided and they're kind of just a straight line, right? It's instantaneous. But I would roll for damage to see how much damage they cause. It would almost always hit at a realistic angle or a realistic range. For torpedo fire, I would roll to hit because it's easier to dodge and it needs a bunch of luck, basically. But I wouldn't roll for damage. If it hits pretty hard. And I would track the angle or direction to determine the impact location on the ship. So if the enemy was firing from up here, right, the torpedo's probably going to hit somewhere around here. I would allow the players to target certain systems, and you make judgment calls about whether they're going to hit that. In terms of differences between damage types, again, this is based on lore, so the phasers would do the most damage to shields, while the torpedoes would do the most damage to hulls. And a critical note was that I warned the players that a torpedo hit on an unshielded ship is almost always fatal, which is consistent with the lore of Star Trek and creates a lot of tension, and it's another reason why players flee combat so quickly. Damage application is based on where the attack came from. You use the location of the hit and your knowledge of Star Trek lore to determine which systems are affected. So if you get hit on the port side with a torpedo and the nacelle, it's going to create a fire there, and it's probably going to damage something towards the rear of the ship. Maybe you got your warp taken out because there's only one nacelle or something. I don't know. Maybe warp is just kind of affected. You can only do low warp now or something. I don't know. You apply logical consequences, right? Enemy says, I'm going to target engineering bay. All right, you hit engineering bay, and then all these systems go down, right? You just think logically about what would happen. And yeah, so the status report in action is basically, you know, the player can read this and at a glance, without even needing to know English, really understand the situation immediately. It doesn't require parsing long paragraphs. The player gets all the information they need in one go. It leads to better decision making and dramatic moments like, oh my god, my starboard shields are gone and I have no power. And it prompts interesting complications, like you order fire from torpedo tube aft and then discover that it's damaged and that's why your torpedo tube isn't firing. Or you could send an away team down and then the transporters break right before you're about to bring them back up. And it forces a lot of improvisation for the players and creates some memorable stories. In terms of setup and feasibility, the hardest part of this is to create the initial template sheet. And once you do, it's pretty easy to make. And updating them turn by turn actually saves you massive amounts of time and isn't a real burden. It actually helps you. Flow benefit is that typing out status updates is terrible and the players skip long text anyways. Visual templates take maybe a few seconds to update once they're prepared, and the players absorb the information instantly. In terms of the original map system versus the status system, the status system is highly sustainable, universally beloved by the players, and I would highly recommend doing something like this. In terms of the map system, I would advise changing it up, probably doing something more along the lines of this. Definitely at least some sort of coordinates system. Don't run the game in Adobe Illustrator. It's just way too unstable and there's too much manual work involved. Don't use overly complicated tiered warp systems because players can only track like 2 to 3 meaningful variables at a time. Don't include complex acceleration or turn radius mechanics because players don't understand them anyway, and you're just doing a lot of work for something that players are never going to feel. Don't write long text descriptions of, you know, visual status stuff. Just use visuals instead. And then probably, you know, render different sections as needed instead of working off of this SVG file. It's just going to be a lot better for you. I would recommend using variable scales, right? You know, so your initial approach can have your very big images and then just make them smaller as they get closer. Like, I don't know. It seems pretty straightforward. Yeah, so that's pretty much how the system ran. Of course, I skipped over a bunch of details, but I think this was the important stuff that a lot of people were curious about, how I solved a lot of these very common problems to most space systems. So I hope this has given you some inspiration. Take care.